Good evening and welcome. I hope you all are safe coming off a stormy night and early morning here in Atlanta. But for those that are joining us this evening's conversation, we really appreciate it. We know it's been a difficult day for a lot of people in terms of connectivity just to begin with, compounded with the pandemic. So we appreciate all of you taking the time to join us for a pretty cool conversation with not only someone I respect, but someone who's actually become a friend. And maybe that's a bad thing when you're a journalist because you probably shouldn't have a lot of friends, but he's like a brother. I call him Brother Mo. It's Diaspora and the University Library at Georgia State University, of course. And also a big thank you to the Decatur Book Festival because they're a partner. And before we get into our conversation with Professor Maurice Hobson, I'm gonna tell you something. You wanna get some different opinions. You bring up Black Mecca at a dinner table, depending on which Black folks are sitting around the table. We'll talk about that. So I am honored to bring in from Georgia State University, African American Studies and History Associate Professor Maurice Hobson. He explores all this in the book, The Legend of the Black Mecca, Politics and Class and the Making of Modern Atlanta. We're gonna dig into all that and a little bit more. Professor Hobson, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, you're the best in the game as to what we're doing here. So I appreciate you for coming through for me.
Well, why you pick this days before the election? You know I'm busy.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question because at the heart of this book is a real conversation around citizenship and voting. And we're talking about, the Black Mecca and the Black New South and what that means in terms of, the Civil Rights Act of 64 coming out of Birmingham and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 coming out of Selma, and how that politically changes the American South, and how Atlanta becomes the place that really that really embodies all of that.
Before we dig into Atlanta and all the inventions and reinventions of itself, I do want to take a moment to just dissect a little bit about what you just said, because I want you to reflect on this moment. We're days away from the presidential election. We're still dealing with this pandemic. How have you come up to sum up 2020? And also, we've had a summer of people protesting, rallying, whatever you want to call it, however you view it, and the folks that are in opposition to that. How do you sum up 2020 so far?
2020, there's an old saying, hindsight is 2020. And 2020 has really caused us to focus on what the issues are at hand. I mean, this pandemic that has overwhelmingly exacerbated poor communities, Black and brown communities, those with health disparities, those with pre-existing conditions, But the protest, I mean, in terms of the racial violence that we've seen in the streets, and there are many that would say that Atlanta wouldn't erupt after that. But I mean, this is still a city, and I'll say this, Atlanta's place in the Black world is a unique place, but we're still human beings, and we still don't always get it right. And that's what a lot of this research is about: is that we shouldn't put the kind of pressure on ourselves to not be human beings, to feel like we need to be all things to all people. And so, 2020 has forced us to focus.
Well, but what's your response to someone who says, "But look, Atlanta has been this Mecca, this place where we don't riot, we don't have uprising." I think you and I had a conversation along with some fellow colleagues from Morehouse and Emory University about that night. Those 2 nights. But what are your response to someone that says, "But Atlanta, this hasn't always been Atlanta, so why are we doing this now?"
And that's because they haven't had a full and deliberate history of the city. I mean, Atlanta, we can go back as far as 1906 with the race massacre that takes place. That was deemed as one of the most violent race massacres to take place, and it was suggested that it was done so to keep, because, white men feared that Black men would sexually assault white women. But the truth of the matter is that it was about economic competition, not only between Blacks and whites, but between the old planter class from before the Civil War and the New South, the emerging New South. We can go easily to 1966 with the Summer Hill Rebellion that takes place, just next to the stadium. The Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, where a man by the name of Harold Prather was shot and killed, and absolute turmoil broke loose. And the thing about it is most of the police officers were sent to protect the new Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, because Ivan Allen, the mayor at the time, had presented the city as being a new sports and entertainment hub. And so the idea is to protect that edifice, that particular stadium. But it did very little to keep the peace. We can go to 1967, the Dixie Hill Rebellion. We can go into the 1980s when we discuss the Eddie Kirkland incident, or the Eddie Callahan incident. We can talk about the Rodney King Rebellion that takes place in 1992. But we can also look at it from this perspective too. When Dr. King was assassinated, and it is clear that Dr. King is Atlanta's most beloved son. Atlanta is the only majority Black city that does not erupt. And most people believe that Atlanta didn't erupt because of some kind of good leadership and biracial negotiation. But the truth of the matter is Atlanta and Black Atlanta respected Dr. King's nonviolent direct action. And so that was really a nod to their most beloved son. And so there is I understand why there are many that would want to see Atlanta as this, this place where we don't riot, we get this opportunity. But we have to be honest about that conversation. And I deal in data and facts. I'm looking at, what things are based on what we can prove.
I want to break down some of the time periods, the references that people will hear that we're about to get into, because you always tell folks that when you're talking about modern Atlanta, but we also need to look at some time periods that predate this modern Atlanta. And I imagine we're talking about the industrial period and before that Reconstruction. So let's begin with the beginning. Let's talk about where Atlanta was for Black folks during Reconstruction, and we'll move our way on up to this modern Atlanta. Let's start with Reconstruction. You're a Black person living in Atlanta. What was life like?
Well, the interesting thing about Reconstruction in Atlanta is when in 1862, during the American Civil War, when General William Tecumseh Sherman was commissioned by Abraham Lincoln to march across the sea from Memphis to Savannah, he comes through Atlanta and he burns the city down. At the time, the city was pretty much a train station. And it was named Terminus, and then Marthasville, and then it's Atlanta, which is short for Atlantica Pacifica, which allowed for trains to go from South Florida up the East Coast to the Midwest to the West. And so that's pretty much what Atlanta was. And he tears up the railroad tracks. But for Black people from 1865 until about 1875 or 1877, Atlanta was a place where, because William Tecumseh Sherman put the district headquarters in downtown Atlanta, it was a place where Black people could go, where they had equal protection and due process under the law before the actual 14th Amendment. And so it's for that reason that Atlanta is special. It is hallowed grounds. And it is for this reason we also see the emergence of 6 historically Black colleges during that time from 1865 to 1886. And so when we talk about Atlanta's true image as a Black Mecca, the first component of it is Black education. That is the pivotal moment. That is a byproduct of the Freedmen's Bureau. The second is Black economics, the emergence of the Sweet Auburn district and the Hunter Street district, which supported the Black education system. The third is Black political empowerment and electoral politics. And we see that take place throughout the 20th century, but we see it really rise with the emergence of Leroy Johnson and Maynard Jackson. And the last is Black expressive culture. So, that's the true essence of the Black Mecca. But what we tend to do oftentimes, and this is something that the mainstream will do. The mainstream will say, well, they're doing well in Atlanta, so we must be doing something right. The thing about it is not everyone is benefiting from that. And
let's talk about that, because at the turn of the century, the 20th century, where new wealth, and you can trace this back to that generational wealth that some people are experiencing today, that starts to take shape. But in terms of Black Atlantans, was there any, can you even go back to this time period where some generational wealth was starting to occur, or the origin of it for any Black Atlantans in this period, in the turn of the century?
Absolutely. I mean, the most popular dentist in all of Atlanta was a dentist by the name of Badger. His last name was Badger. And I mean, he had a major clientele. I mean, this is 1859, so this is before the Civil War. But you also have historical figures such as Alonzo Herndon, who was born in Social Circle, Georgia, in Walton County, just east of the city. He's mixed race. His mother's enslaved. His father is white. His father sends he and his brother to Clayton County to learn the barbering trade. They set up a barbershop at where the Flatiron Building is, right on campus. And he basically engages an all-white clientele, business clientele, Coca-Cola, the trains, the train moguls. And in some ways, he's taken under the wing of many of these white businessmen, and they talk with him about, really creating or promoting benevolent societies and mutual aid societies. And he creates the Atlanta Life Insurance Company in 1905, which becomes a major stalwart for the Sweet Auburn district, which was deemed as the richest Black district in the United States. And that may be some self-promotion, but that's the Atlanta Life Insurance is the vanguard of that. So
there's a shift that's going to take, though. And we know that racism and segregation, which probably didn't actually go away, we know that. But there's a shift here because the whole climate along the South is changing in terms of, you talked about, building generational wealth, but there was no power in leadership.
That's right.
Not in elected leadership. So as we enter that, maybe let's say the 40s and 50s, what are we seeing Atlanta look like, particularly for Black folks?
So in 1944, a man by the name of Prentice King decides to challenge the all-white Georgia primary in the state of Georgia, and he goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it presents the King v. Chapman court case, whereas the U.S. Supreme Court declares the all-white primary in the state of Georgia as unconstitutional. What this does is this moves Black voters to the center of a conversation. And with some work with the professors at the Atlanta University Center and Grace Towns Hamilton, what they're able to do is they're able to create a voting drive campaign, which increases the population of Black voters up to about 700,000, which is about 28% of the voting bloc. So now statewide, in any capacity, any white politician who wants to be elected, they have to come and court the Black vote. What's happening during this time in Atlanta is two gentlemen, John Wesley Dobbs and Austin T. Walden. John Wesley Dobbs was a male worker. He was the highest ranking Black Mason in all of Georgia. He was deemed as the unofficial mayor of the Sweet Auburn district. And A.T. Walden was the first Black lawyer to work for the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. They come together and they create the Atlanta Negro Voters League. And the job is that, and this is extremely sexist in this term, but it was 36 of the most prominent businessmen who would engage the white business elite, who were overwhelmingly men, and they would really create this conversation around race relations that the historian Tamiko Brown Nagin beautifully puts as the the Atlanta style of biracial negotiation. And so there was this real kind of discourse about race. The issue is that only a handful of Black people were involved, and a handful of white people were involved, and they were brokering deals for the larger communities, but not talking to the large communities.
But as part of brokering those deals, Atlanta is segregated in terms of housing, in terms of where folks are living. Mm-hmm. Are you telling me that both communities were, and I wouldn't be surprised, were comfortable with that? That was part of brokering these deals? You all have what you all have, and we have what we have? That part of it?
Hey, that's a slippery slope. That's an excellent question, because one of the things that we see from the Sweet-Auburn district is that the way in which the Sweet-Auburn district, the Black thoroughfare, is able to benefit is that it deals with an all-Black clientele. And so for some wealthy Black folk, it was in their best interest to maintain segregation because it allowed for, some aspects of economic autonomy. It allowed for political autonomy. It allowed for, some different ways in which Black communities could thrive on their own. I mean, one of the things that I have to grapple with in public all the time is engaging people who say that Black people had it better before what we call desegregation or integration. And hey, that may be true on the surface level. But when we begin to talk about second-class citizenship and the fact that you could not, your rights were not respected and you couldn't vote, which meant that you couldn't change, the conditions of your life. I grapple with that because of the civil rights component. And so, yeah, there were some Black merchants that benefited from maintaining segregation.
Well, now we're going to shift into what arguably, I don't know why people would argue about it, but I mean, this is a pivotal time in American history. We know what happens over in Mississippi with Emmett Till.
Absolutely.
That marker right there. And then you could point to some other instances, but Emmett Till, that marker, and then also enter what my industry, the media, because it's that photo that sparks a whole chapter in history. What was Atlanta becoming then, as all that surrounding Emmett Till and his murder? Was Atlanta starting to shift, and you started to see people protest? And then there's a young man by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that's coming up, and the rest, as they say, is history. But I'll let you take it from there.
So you are absolutely correct. I mean, Emmett Till's murder in 1955. I mean, that's a 1954, 1955 is a watershed moment on so many levels. I mean, the first is Brown v. Board of Education, which makes separate but equal unconstitutional. And mind you, separate but equal really gets its language from Atlanta when Booker T. Washington gave his speech in Piedmont Park during the Atlanta Cotton States International Exhibition. Mm-hmm. So Brown v. Board declares segregation unconstitutional. And when we talk about segregation, what we're saying here is that public property becomes white private property. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have the Montgomery bus boycott that's taking place during that same time, where Dr. King is actually really kind of gaining traction. And then with Emmett Till and just the harsh and brutal reality of that lynching, because that's what it was. And the fact that the Emmett Till case brings in so many aspects of things, because here it was, Emmett Lewis Till was from Chicago. He had gone back home, as many folk from Chicago and St. Louis, like you're from, Rose, and New York, Ohio, Detroit, they would go back home for certain things. And he has some random interaction with a white woman and he's lynched. But the fact that was published really made America look at itself. And it sets the stage for what later happens in Little Rock, Arkansas, with the 1957 issue in Little Rock. And when the press is there watching this and they're saying, so you mean to tell me that they're killing people or they're maiming folk just because they want to get a good education or just because they want civil rights? This is absolutely crazy. Well, what Atlanta is able to do is during this time, they had a very smart mayor, Mayor William Hartsfield, who coins the term and presents Atlanta as the city too busy to hate, as a city that was willing to have a conversation around race and to try to work together. And thus Atlanta emerges as the poster child for race relations in the American South.
I want to talk about then what's happening over at the HBCUs, because these young kids, and you know how they say, each generation is weaker and wiser, but this generation, they had a different approach to dealing with some things, maybe than their mamas and grandmamas, and definitely their ancestors before then. So now we see this shift. What is happening over at Spelman and Clark and Morris Brown and Morehouse?
So you have the emergence of a very smart group of young people who were really paying attention to organizing and wanted integration. They wanted to be able, they didn't want to necessarily just hang out with white people per se. They just wanted access to the same things. They wanted to be able to eat places. They wanted to be able to ride, the streetcars or the buses. They wanted to be able to go to the schools. And so you had the student sit-ins, and Ella Baker and all of her greatness and wisdom was able to really bring about, the likeness of a, Congressman John Lewis, who was a young person at the time, Julian Bond, who had served in that same seat. They were able to work together with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were just able to work in particular ways to try to make Atlanta more inclusive. And even though Brown v. Board of Education outlaws segregation, it's not until 1961 that Atlanta actually integrates. So it takes 6 to 7 years because of all deliberate speed for a city such as Atlanta to integrate, but Atlanta is the first to do so. And it's because of the activity of those young people at the Atlanta University Center.
And we have some Black wealth during this time, because it was that quote unquote Black wealth that would lend the money, the signs, lend the money to get folks out of jail, lend the money to fund, to support the cause. But I want to take a second to let our viewers know who was the underbelly of that. Who were the, not underbelly, but who were the folks that were supporting these young kids? And there's some prominent names there.
Yeah, the Herndon family. I mean, Norris Herndon at the time, which is Alonzo Herndon's son. Geneva Hagerbrooks, who owned a funeral home on Auburn Avenue. I'm just blanking. The Pascal brothers. I mean, that was one of the things that the Pascal brothers did, is they would make sure that the student activists were fed. Grace Townsend, the Russell family. Yeah. I mean, and this shows, and see, what's so beautiful about the Atlanta student sit-ins is that it demonstrates that while white America may say, well, an Alonzo Herndon is very different than, Harold Prather, who was shot. The truth of the matter is they weren't that different. They interacted with each other. They went to the same barbershops. They worshiped at the same churches. And so because of segregation in the American South, Black folk all lived amongst each other. And so with this being said, it became very clear that all aspects of Black Atlanta were all on deck to make sure that these young people were safe, to make sure that they had money to be bailed out, to make sure they had signs, to make sure they had, food, and make sure that they had a place to go if their parents got upset with them because they were protesting.
We've talked about this progress and achievements, quality of life for Black Atlantans, but you contend, and this is where this book comes in, because you contend that this wasn't the case for all, and especially for Atlanta's Black poor. And I think I asked you this question last time, and I wanted to bring it back up again because I think it's so important. Was Atlanta's Black poor, was this segment of the community, were they overlooked or dismissed at some point with all this progress and achievement? Is that a fair question?
It is a fair question. It's absolutely a fair question. But this is where I can and someone wants to engage me in public about the legend of the Black Mecca. This is where I can tell who actually read the book and who didn't. Oftentimes people will read the jacket, and you have to understand, jacket is to sell the book in some particular ways. They'll think that I am pointing my fingers at the Black elite. The truth of the matter is not pointing at the Black elite. The biggest gladiator pit in the world is American capitalism. And what we're really discussing here is how Black folk of all different ranges are having to negotiate in this very conservative, very discriminatory, very racist kind of society. And what happens is because of that, because of how American capitalism, promotes competition, you have winners and losers. And the sad part about it is only a few were able to win. So I'm not necessarily saying that the Black elite threw the Black working class and poor under the bus. What I'm saying is this is a byproduct of American capitalism on who are the winners and who are the losers. And so to say that fairly, yes, the Black working class and poor were left out of that whole narrative.
Well, we're going to get into an area now of Atlanta that it wasn't unique. I mean, other cities experienced this. Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis. We have this thing called white flight.
Yes.
And also now here's another important aspect because MARTA wanted to come in, move Black folk around, and some folks didn't like that. So now we get into this late 60s, early 70s, where you're starting to see this shift again, another shift. And as you look at Clayton County, I know we're talking about Atlanta, but Clayton County, a perfect example of what happened with white flight. But we'll stick with Atlanta. So now as the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, we've got all that now. And we're in the early 70s. We're in the 70s. And you know what that era was like. What's going on with Atlanta? What are we seeing here?
Well, Atlanta is building. Atlanta has become a sports and entertainment center. I mean, the Atlanta Falcons show up in the city. The Atlanta Braves show up in the city. The Atlanta Hawks show up in the city. Muhammad Ali, when he's able to fight again, he comes back in 1970. I mean, that was 50 years ago on October 26th, on Monday, I think. That's been 50 years. And what's going on is the downtown development. I mean, Atlanta has really put its money in terms of putting up beautiful hotels. John Porter and the Cylinder Hotel. I'm just blanking on it. Not Hyatt. The Westin.
The Westin,
yeah. So you got that. You got the Hyatt, which is like the new booming hotel. And as a result of this, when Ali comes to fight in 1971, Johnson Publication, Ebony Magazine, basically calls Atlanta a Black Mecca of the South. Mm-hmm. Because there's a new political movement. You have stalwarts such as State Senator Leroy Johnson, who was able to shut Governor Lester Maddox down, make him be quiet in order to bring Ali back. You begin to see beautiful, Black folk that are moving back down South on a concept of what I call the Black New South. The Black New South is a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Sun Belt boom, where tech companies are moving south. We see the shift from the industrial age, from moving north and getting a job in a factory, to the information age. And so now we see banking, we see computers, we see all of these different things. And Atlanta is ripe. And then you have the emergence of a feisty Black politician, a statesman by the name of Maynard Holbrook Jackson Jr., who really brings it to everybody.
But you also have the infrastructure. You just mentioned how the infrastructure was helping. Well, there was another type of infrastructure development called public housing.
Absolutely. And
I know that's a whole nother book for some people.
Yes.
That plays a pivotal role here too, in how Atlanta is going to progress through the 70s and 80s.
It is interesting that you bring that up. The first public housing, first housing project ever built was built in Atlanta. It was in the 20s.
Was it Techwood?
That was University Homes. Hope, the first Black president of Morehouse, and then the Atlanta University Center was on the board for that. But what's also taking place during this time is the Model Cities Initiative, mm-hmm. and the building of the interstates as well. And what they purposely did is they put the interstates in areas that would displace Black business, the Sweet Auburn District. And that's where we begin to see the demise of the Sweet Auburn District, is because of them routing the interstates. And then we start talking about public housing. We begin to talk about annexation. We begin to talk about public transportation in MARTA. We begin to see the real workings, the sanitation and sewage and water, and who's getting the benefit of what. And these are real issues because these are paying citizens. These Black folks are paying citizens, but not getting that love.
So what did Maynard inherit, and what did he leave? So
Maynard inherited, that's a loaded question.
I know, I'm sorry, I apologize.
It's great. Maynard inherited a city that is on the move, that's moving forward. Of course, Ivan Allen was the mayor in the 1960s, and Ivan Allen was considered to be extremely progressive. And then Sam Massell was mayor. Sam Massell would be the first Jewish mayor. And Sam was doing great work. But with Maynard, who was somewhat of a usurper, and how he becomes a thorn in the side when he's vice mayor. And then you have, Maynard arriving as mayor. We see the issues of the city being crime. I mean, the city was deemed as, high in crime. We see brutality. That was a major, major problem. One of the things Maynard Jackson says is, he says, if there's an incident of police brutality, I will prosecute you myself. Now, that means that the police didn't know and understand that only the DA can really do the prosecuting. But, I'm not saying it was wolf tickets. What we also see is that about 0.3% of all of the city contracts were going to minority contractors. Maynard Jackson, with his affirmative action policies, really does open the city up to roughly around 35%, and it becomes the gold standard for affirmative action. So when we see that, and when Maynard was mayor, he was mayor for 12 years. Sporadically, he was mayor from 73 to 81, and then from 89 to 93. It's about $10 billion that comes through the city, and 35% of that goes to Black folk. That's a lot of money. And so what that also does is that makes Atlanta that much more attractive to Black entrepreneurs around the rest of the world. And you see this major dash towards Atlanta. We see him use this with the expansion of the Hartsfield Airport. And it now bears his name as Hartsfield-Jackson, which is an interesting story within itself. But we also saw with Maynard Jackson was his creation of the neighborhood planning units, which allowed for poor, working, and middle-class Black folk to have some say in what the development would be in the city. That's one of the issues that we hear today, is that there is no representation for communities to say what happens in their community in terms of urban.
And that's also because, and you know this, there have been so many promises made to those Black communities, particularly on the west side or south side.
Exactly.
When all the stadiums have been built, when all this development has been built, even now with the Gulch, and even with the Falcons' new stadium. So, yeah, the MPU, the vision, it was a nice vision and mission, but in terms of execution and what it was supposed to be, you can argue today that, not that they're not powerful, but they haven't been powerful enough, because at the end of the day, the policymakers and the folks in City Hall and all of the developers, it's going to be about how can I help you? And let's be clear, some of these neighborhoods have been, even around Georgia State, your own institution, you know that. Turner Field.
Exactly. And you bring up a point, because it goes back to the point that I made earlier, is that this is not all about white versus Black. There are nuances within Black communities and how this is seen. Mm-hmm. There's an assumption, particularly this past summer when, of course, racism just overshadowed the pandemic and everyone wanted to have a conversation about race. And the interesting thing about it is that white America would ask any Black person about race, and it's like, and expected them to just be able to articulate this kind of, lecture about what this is. And the truth of the matter is that there are different experiences for different people. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of what we see in the legend of the Black Mecca has to do with those different Black communities that are unseen from the outside. And I think I think you asked a very fair question about, the failure of public housing. I mean, the displacement of people from 1974 to 1990, I think the public housing was cut by 74%. What are we going to do with all of these people? So there's some issues, some policy issues that are here. And that's where this hinges on. Like, let me tell y'all something. When I started writing this book, I loved the city. And when I was a kid, I would come to Atlanta, I would go to Six Flags and I'd hang out and I'd be with my older brothers and, hang out at Freaknik and do all of the cool, foolish stuff, hung out at the Olympics. What was eye-opening for me and taught me a real life lesson is it's one thing to think you know something. It's another thing if you study it. And that's a lot of my reckoning is I thought I was walking into one situation. I found something else based on research.
What you doing at Freaknik? That's a whole nother conversation.
Trying to understand my world,
I want to get to the 96 Olympics and that era, and then the emergence of this little thing called, Southern hip hop and that whole thing. Is this a turning point? Because Atlanta's now on the world stage with the Olympics. Mm-hmm. And then we have this something new, a new art form that's being created out of Atlanta. So we see another shift here to maybe you make the argument of where we are today, connect all these dots for us, and then connect the first time you heard Outkast for us.
So this is where we are. It's an interesting thing. I was supposed to grow up in Atlanta, Georgia. Mm-hmm. My father was offered a job to train all the scientists at Morehouse School of Medicine. He was offered the job in 1981. I remember us coming to the city and they offered him the job. And he didn't take the job, and he never told us why. And I remember probably being 16, 17 years old, and we were riding to Atlanta. He was like, yeah, we were supposed to live here. He was like, but they were killing Black kids and nothing was being done. Mm-hmm. I remember that. But I also just remember how, one of the things you would hear in the 1980s was, the Miami boys, like, be careful with the Miami boys. And, there's this kind of street war going on in crack cocaine.
Yeah.
When Atlanta begins to push for the 1996 Olympics, what happens is a good dress rehearsal was the Democratic National Convention of 1988. And one of the reasons Atlanta was chosen was because it was this new city that was really working some things out and had been this poster child in terms of race relations. But the other aspect of it was, at that time, the last Democratic president had been President Jimmy Carter, who was from Georgia. And so it was kind of a way of kind of paying homage. And there were some real issues. I mean, hotel capacity, parks, but then there was also this issue of crime and what would be done with the underground and whatnot, and then the venue in terms of the Omni. But when Atlanta then is able to really win the 1990 bid, what's particular about this is you have this real street turf, this turf war going on with crack cocaine between the Atlanta hustlers and the Miami boys. And we see, all kinds of assault weapons on the street. We see extreme violence. I mean, 1990, Atlanta was the most violent city in the United States. We see bigger guns. We see hollow point bullets. We see a public safety conversation, the creation of the Red Dog Police, the militarization of the police. We see the school to prison pipeline. But with the Olympics, particularly the weaponizing of Dr. King's dream presented to the rest of the world to show what Atlanta was, only to allow for the business elite of the city to draw an invisible circle around the city, which was known as the Olympic Ring, to take back to downtown real estate. And we see the displacement, disenfranchisement, criminalization, and demonization of the indigenous people who were here, who were Black and poor, is we see some very interesting aspects of discrimination. And what happens with this is, because of all this, because Atlanta is on the world stage, its people, its history and culture is being paid attention to. And you have this new town of the South with Babyface, with Kenny Babyface Edmonds and Antonio Reed. Yeah. They come down here with the Face Records, and it's a hotbed because they're chasing Bobby Brown. You got Bunny Jackson Ransom, Maynard Jackson's first wife, who's brought Cameo and SOS Band to the state. So it's virgin territory. Taxes are cheap. And Atlanta emerges. But when this hip hop debuts, it's soul and funk, real soul and funk, like James Brown, Gladys Knight, Curtis Mayfield soul and funk, with hip hop that is critical of what I call the Olympification of Atlanta. And so you asked me when was the first time I heard Outkast. I was a junior in high school. My best friend, Roderick Bars, had a 77 Cutlass Supreme. At the time, we were rocking bald heads. You purposely cut your hair off and be bald headed. And I just thought it was rebel music. And I grew up in Selma, Alabama. But in 1995, when I was a senior in high school, Outkast was the headliner for the 30th commemoration of Bloody Sunday. And it was interesting because here I am growing up understanding Dr. King and understand Amelia Boynton Robinson and the Reverend Dr. F.D. Reese. I met John Lewis when I was 10 years old. But I'm looking at my own generation that's critical of that generation, but they're talking civil rights. And I begin to make the assertion that the Dirty South, which is the expressive arm of the political movement, the Black New South, is where Atlanta emerges, and the origins of Dirty South was extremely political. Outkast and Goody Mob were extremely political in what they were saying in their work.
And I also just want to, because I don't know if he's watching, but he might get mad. I also want to just say, when talking about these new genres, I mean, you got to give Tip and folk, I don't know nobody get mad at me, because trap music has its place in music history, whether you like it or not. It has its place, and look, all these cats are storytellers. Then you got the neo soul movement here too.
Absolutely. So, so to Tip, to Clifford Harris, to Jason Orr, my good friend Jason Orr, and funk jazz, and all of these different things. I'm not discounting you all. I just had to cut the book off in 1996. So but you're right. I mean, T.I. and his work with the trap and how, you know, T.I. he really coins that trap sound. And he looks at it from different perspectives. I mean, you know, UG Underground Kings and from Port Arthur, Texas, we're doing similar. 8 Ball and MJG from Memphis were doing similar things. But Tip gives it an opportunity to do it the Atlanta way with the, you know, with the hi-hats and with the 808s and, you know, and really brought that Atlanta swagger to that game. And so no disrespect to the brother at all. Killer Mike is able to kind of to work different ways, and so no disrespect to him. I just had to cut it off in 1996.
And also want to say, Jermaine Dupri, you have your place here too. So
absolutely,
don't get mad.
And so Jermaine Dupri actually has a real role in the research that's done in the Legend of the Black Mecca. He's connected to Cameo. His father does light shows for SOS Cameo. That's where Jermaine Dupri gets a lot of his training. And you know, one of the unsung heroes about this is two aspects. When Maynard Jackson creates the Bureau of Cultural Affairs to produce experiential art in Atlanta, by and large for Black folk, and then his divorce from Bunny, who would later be Ransom, and the creation of First Class Inc., where she creates the first Black woman PR firm in the city. And she's able to really bring, you know, Cameo, well, SOS Band Cameo, works with Bohannon. You know, Curtis Mayfield is moving here in 1979. I mean, you know, it gets no better than Curtis Mayfield in terms of, you know, that sound. And that is influential when you have Rico Wade and Sleepy Brown and Ray Murray, who are actually just straight up saying like, yeah, man, we were listening to Cameo and Gladys Knight and James Brown, and we were mimicking that and we were rapping to it, you know. So, so that's where we are.
That's where we are. I know we have some questions. I want to get to them. Again, you could send your questions to libevents@gsu.edu. Here's one. What role, if any, did GSU play in the 20th century social justice movement that were led through Atlanta and AUC leadership? Did Georgia State have any role here in all this?
You're talking about this past weekend, this past summer?
No, well, I think the question is in the 20th century social justice movement.
So, you know, we have some very bright and passionate students at Georgia State University. Georgia State has really grown significantly in the last 20 years. And as a result of that, we have student organizers on campus that have been really, you know, upholding the bloodstained banner. I was so proud of them this summer. Even with pandemic, they were out there. And I remember telling one of my friends who's a police officer, like, don't arrest our students. But the students at the AUC and the students at Georgia State University have done an excellent job of really keeping, you know, the conversation around race and equity, around, respect in terms of gender. Also, we have students on campus who are doing major research on Black women and maternity. I mean, like the idea of what we're teaching at Georgia State, and I'm sure they're teaching at the Atlanta University, and I'm always impressed with those young people too, is that we are looking at full civil and human rights for all people.
But did it take Georgia State a while to get there, though? I mean, did we see Georgia State back in the day that their students do what, you know, students were doing at AUC? No, they weren't. And the thing about that is, you know, on one level, that's an infrastructure issue because before, you know, Georgia State was a transient school. You go in, do your classes, you go home. Now, you know, the forms they're doing, there's major development going on downtown. And, you know, there's a struggle right now on whether or not Georgia State has always been a neighbor in terms of that, particularly with the Old Fourth Ward and the Sweet Auburn district. And a lot of our students of all walks of life have really been pushing Georgia State to be a good neighbor in terms of where things work. But I will say this, I mean, Georgia State has grown. I mean, we're at more than 50,000 students. We have a large, diverse population, not just in race. I mean, we have a significant LGBTQIA community. We have a significant brown community. We have a significant first generation community. And so, yes, I mean, Georgia State has come along. The students have come along, and the institution has to catch up. And but hey, I use that as a platform to make sure that I
we're creating leaders that are able to engage that way.
Here's another question. If Atlanta ever was a Black Mecca, is it today? And are there indicators that suggest that it will be a Black Mecca in another generation? Good question.
Yeah, it's a legitimate question. So this is my issue with the Black Mecca. Okay. This is a unique place for Black people. Now, mind you, I just told you all I grew up in Selma, Alabama. No disrespect, Selma, Alabama, S-Town, but I'm not trying to go back. So what I'm saying is this is a unique place. But when we begin to utter the Black Mecca's name like that, we make an assumption that this is the be all and end all for all Black people. And it's not just about Atlanta. There's a movement going. My good friend, Bain Joyner, has this Atlanta Influences Everything piece movement. And it's a great marketing scheme. I mean, I like what Bain is doing. And I often tell him, I say, well, I can't wear the shirt, man. I said, because I'm from Alabama, my family's from Mississippi. And I'm like, I don't want to turn my people off. And what I'm saying is that it's Black folk all across the American South that are fighting and striving. And Atlanta is a part of that as well as everyone else. But I'm saying all that to say that right now, I mean, when we just talk about population, 1990, Atlanta was 67% Black. I think it's 51.5% now.
Yeah.
There's real displacement. I mean, the cost of housing is so high. We just had the largest cheating scandal in the history of the United States that overwhelmingly failed Black and brown children. These are young people that I am going to have to see, that I'm already seeing in my classrooms, but I'm going to have to teach them for the next 10 years or so. So we have to be careful about when we say Black Mecca. I mean, if we're talking about expressive culture, yeah, Atlanta's hot. I mean, it's creative. But we have some other work. We have some work to do in terms of full civil and human rights.
Here's another question, because you have some students watching. I don't know if they need extra credit or not, but here's a question. When did you decide to pursue an academic career, and how did you become, involved in history? You kind of went into it as an historian.
So hey, that's a great question. I went to college to actually be a medical doctor, and I had done very well my first year. I played college football, and my freshman year, November 8th, 1995, my freshman year, I was in practice and fell on my shoulder and ended up having to have shoulder surgery my freshman year. And during that time of rehab, I'd grown up on college campuses. My mother's a school teacher. My father was a college professor, and I knew what college was. But I just found myself really being impassioned with people. And there was a Kairos moment to where, it was just brought to my attention that your best passion is to really do history and politics, to study people. And it was the day Tupac died, October 1996, September 1996.
September, yeah. Wow.
And I went and watched the movie A Time to Kill. And I remember saying to myself, I want to do something like that. And I went to my academic advisor and I said to him, I want to change my major to history and politics because I had like a 3.8 in pre-med at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, which is one of the top medical facilities in the nation. And he says to me, well, why do you want to do that? And I said, I just feel like this is what the universe wants me to do. And I made a decision that day. And believe you all, I've had some setbacks in terms of academia. I graduated from college. I did a master's degree. I struggled with getting into PhD programs, but I kept plugging at it. Got an opportunity at Illinois. And once I got that opportunity, I said, I will not fail. And I just gave it all that I had. And so if I can be, just to be very transparent, academia is a little different for me because I do it well, but it's a culture that I'm not used to. And so I had to figure out ways to present African-American history to the public more or less than academic crowds. And as a result of that, this is part of the reason why you may see me on documentaries and doing all kinds of different things in terms of that. So
let me ask you this. What's next then? What research are you working on? That's actually a question too.
Yeah, I have a lot. There's a lot to process. And some of my friends on campus who keep me steered straight, Dr. Jenny Ward Robinson and Dr. Elizabeth West and Dr. Jonathan Gales.
It's a major job, man. It's a major job, from what I hear.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things to where you got to look at what you can actually do in the time that is allotted, right? So we're developing content. I had recent success with being a producer for the Atlanta Child Murder docuseries on HBO. That's based on chapter 3 of my book. I've done a lot of work with Hip Hop Evolution. There are a lot of ideas, but I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in kind of doing a discussion on the Black New South that really is allowing me to connect back with Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia to look at public history and how that works. And we're talking about public memory. We're talking about violence. We're talking about all of those different things. So I'm looking at something that will really kind of beat the chest of the Black New South in a national and international implication.
You know, you and I have always had conversations, just had one today, about the legend of the Black Mecca and all the optics around that. I talked to someone within this 21st century, and they said that Atlanta was still trying to find its identity. Matter of fact, the person described Atlanta as a gangly teenager. I'm going to ask you, what is Atlanta's identity right now in 2020? Right now, this moment.
You know, I think Atlanta, I would agree with that. But I think that Georgia is in a Kairos moment right now. Mm-hmm. Right now. I'm talking about right now in 2020. The political grounds are changing around us. We see, you know, very strong candidates, women who are pushing forward. We see, you know, real conversations around voter suppression and all kinds of different things. I think that Atlanta and the state of Georgia is in a place to where it can really describe and define who they are and stand up and be the most beautiful, innovative, creative city that there is on a beautiful landscape. So what I'm saying is that it's important for Atlanta to really grasp where it is, understand what it has. Don't try to be New York. Don't try to be the Black Hollywood. Be yourself. Do exactly what it is that you do, and it's beautiful. And I think that we have something special here, regardless of what direction this city goes. I mean, like I think that this is a beautiful city. It's you can get to any place in the world from this city. I mean, you get all aspects of good life before COVID, and you know, hopefully this thing will lift. You know, if we can wear a mask. And so I think that there's a unique moment in time for Atlanta.
Is there a sequel, part 2?
There may be. There may be some tributaries around it. I have some thoughts of mine. I'm scared to share them because people kind of sit around and try to figure out what Maurice Hobson is doing with his work. But there's been some real interest in not only sequels in terms of writing, TV shows, documentaries about, you know, where we are and what we're doing. And as much as I love Atlanta, there are other things that I like to do. But right now, I just really do feel very comfortable, good, and at home here in the Atlanta metro area. And I understand the city in such a way, you know, historically, politically, socially, culturally, that I feel like Atlanta has, some sides of Atlanta have accepted me as one of their own. And so this is home for me. And so, and why not do place-based research? So. Well,
let me ask you this then. This will be our final question before we say goodbye then. How have you handled since Atlanta, you know, has adopted you, when maybe some of those adoptive parents, you know, have said, the elders, you know what I'm talking about, have pulled you aside, said, now look here, Maurice, I got some issues with what you're putting in this book. How do you handle criticism? And from the notables?
Well, I'm a Southern. I am Black and I am Southern, which means that you are always respectful in the eyes of the elders. That is their right. But I can nicely ask them, where's the lie? What lie did I tell in the book? Like, that's the thing that gets them. But I will tell you this, you know, and I'll give you an example of this. Ambassador Andrew Young and I are really good friends. We talk, and I talk with a lot of statesmen and women around here. You know, one of the things that Ambassador Young said to me one day, he said, Martin used to say that there are statistics. He said there are lies, there are bigger lies, and there are statistics. Mm-hmm. And what he was saying is, you know, we can't always look at that. And I get what he's saying, but I listen to all of that because let me tell you something. One of the things I know about that book is, in the process of writing, many of the elders in this city who you refer to, I understand that there was a lot more in the decision-making going than what we know. What I take from that is that I don't ever want to be in public service like that. So as a result of that, I listen and I figure out how I can help them. I try to get insight from them and do some different things, and I try to apply it in the next scholarship that I write.
All right. It's called The Legend of the Black Mecca, Politics and Class and the Making of Modern Atlanta. Its author is Dr. Maurice Hobson, Associate Professor of African American Studies, Georgia State University, author, producer, director, freestyler. Can you freestyle? You can freestyle.
I cannot rap, but I can sure look cool in the background.
You the hype man.
I'm the cool one. Just I can just kind of look off in the sky. You know how they do.
Oh, that's funny. I had a lot of fun with this conversation, man. A good conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you all who took the time to join us in this conversation. Again, sponsored by the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora and the University Library. Also, the Decatur Book Festival is a partner as well. And as always, much love to everyone over at Georgia State University. We love y'all. Love talking to all the folks over there. Y'all know y'all can come on the show anytime. So thank you so much. Peace, everyone.
Peace. Thank you so much, Rose.
All right, now.